Wednesday. Jacob Harkins with Vintage View, and I'm here with Jeff Adater, who is the CEO and founder of the InVintory app. I emphasize the VIN because it's VIN, because it's like the coolest iPhone accessory for people who need to like track all their bottles of wine. So, Jeff, thank you for joining us from Toronto.
Well, thank you. It's my pleasure to always speak with you about anything to do with wine.
I agree. This is our second of 3 planned Facebook Lives with your fine company. I won't call it a startup, or maybe it is a startup. I don't even know where that crosses in there, but your fine technology. How about I leave it at that? If I fall over at any point during this, I just got my second COVID shot like an hour ago, and I'm assuming I'll be upright by the end of this, though my wife has been making fun of me all day. So Jeff is actually a customer of Vintage View. It's part of how we came to know one another. And today's topic, last week we covered a lot of how to understand where to start with collecting wine and what's collectible and all that fun stuff. And now we're shifting over, for those who have decided to be collectors, how do we start with a wine cellar? And I figured Jeff, as someone who has experience building his own personal wine cellar, got some questions about that part of it, and I'm going to turn it over to you as the wine collector. See if you can stump me as the guy who pretends to be a wine cellar expert.
Wonderful. Well, yeah, I did buy my wine setup from Vintage View, and I was quite happy. I've had it now for the better part of, I'd say, 5 years, and 6 years, that particular cellar, and it holds 1,300 bottles quite nicely. And so I'm a very big fan of your product. I'll have to tell you that to begin with. I mean, I've looked at many cellars, had many opportunities to put any kind of cellar in there, from wood to any other material. And when I saw this particular setup and the configuration I was able to achieve, there was no turning back. And I just built another.
Go on, keep it coming. Keep it coming.
I was such a big fan, and I built a wine wall in another location and using the same rack. So again, big fan of this product. But I'll tell you, yesterday I went to my local bottle shop, picked up 12 bottles of wine, decided I would carry them back 3 long blocks. They're longer now in retrospect than I thought they would. So I was carrying 12 wine bottles, had to stop a number of times. I really thought I could make it, but couldn't make it. And I just realized how heavy bottles are. So I Googled the weight of a bottle, 2.5 pounds, thought about how many bottles I have on this Vintage View rack. And I thought, how in the name of everything good does this thing stay up? So I wanted to pose that question to you first. How do these walls stay up?
You're starting with the softball. I thought you were going to ask me, like, what wine rack color goes best with wood. That's a great question. And so we have a couple of things that we always consider. Number one is, what's the surface of the wall? And a lot of wine cellars, when they're bigger wine cellars, there's a lot of what I'd call pre-construction. So when you can see the studs in the wall, and oftentimes your contractor or the do-it-yourself or whomever is putting it in will put in a plywood backer or some sort of really stable wall. In that case, we know how strong that is, and you start putting in wood lags into the wine racks, and they're not going anywhere. You can arguably do pull-ups on a wine rack, ours or any others. The dicey part, or I guess mentally dicey part, is when we're speaking about drywall. And drywall is where we excel, and we can store a lot of wine in there without a problem, but it's a matter of kind of explaining the science behind it so that people understand that, yeah, you can put your Chateau Lafite in a wine rack hanging on drywall. So with Vintage View, there's 2 things that we got. Number one is the drywall anchors, right? And if you go to any Home Depot or, I'm trying to think, you have a Home Depot style thing in Canada that I'm drawing a blank on. Home hardware. You'll see them, and they're all rated, and they'll say they're good for 20 pounds, 50 pounds, 100 pounds. So right there, that the hardware itself is rated for that rack. A fully loaded rack might be 120, 130 pounds per section. So that right there, okay, if I have the right hardware, that'll work. There's another piece to think about this too, is how does the wall support all that weight? And in typical drywall or plasterboard, depending on your lexicon or which way you're describing it, eventually you could potentially pull stuff out of the wall, right? And so our racks rely on what's called shear weight. And so instead of pull-out weight, where literally you can pull it out of the wall, the more weight you put on our racks, the more it distributes it throughout the actual column itself, to a point where there's virtually, I mean, we've been doing this for 20 years, literally 20 years this month, and we've never had one issue of a properly installed wine rack into drywall ever coming out of the wall. So it's shear weight and it is hardware selection. Those two things work hand in hand. It's kind of, I've learned a lot about this actually a little bit recently. It's part of our, I didn't even realize this until recently. We have a patent for our wine racks that make the bottles look the way they do a little bit. And part of the utility on that is actually the welding points that allow for that shear weight. So you can still talk to people. They'll never want to put their expensive bottles into drywall, and that's fine. Plywood is, well, used to be cheap. I guess plywood this last 6 months has become incredibly expensive, but so that was a somewhat of, yeah, there we go. It's soft.
Well, there's some science behind it, because you look at, we're so invested in our wine, and you get it up on the wall. And I'll sometimes, and I don't know if this is what most wine people do, but I'll sometimes just go down to my cellar and look at my wine. I mean, I'm that sort of involved with what it looks like, and then to have such an important part of my life think that it's not based in science, not based in good physics, it worries me. So I'm very happy to hear that answer.
Yeah, and just know that I was not the one who designed that, which should give you a lot of relief, because I'm good at making pictures look pretty. I'm not good at making stuff hang on walls.
Right. Now let me ask you also. So I used somebody else to put this up. I didn't trust myself. I'm not that sort of mechanically minded, or don't have that skill set. Can someone do this themselves, though? Do they have to hire somebody? Can you put up these racks yourself if you have? What sort of skill level do you need?
So that's a pretty broad question too, because there's a couple things to consider. You talk about just hanging wine racks on the wall, or are you building a full cellar with cooling, right?
I think I would say putting the metal racks on the wall. Forget about the actual wine cellar, but just getting them attached to a wall, be it drywall or be it plywood in the back. But is it fairly simple?
I would say so. And again, proof of that is I've done it, right? Like I can do it. And we've recently actually upgraded to our, we've partnered with a company called Built, which is as cool in technology as InVintory is for wine, as Built is for 3D instruction. So you can look at your mobile device, twirl around and see how to do it all. But it's, if you have confidence and a drill bit and don't mind drilling holes in your wall, and then absolutely you can do it. Otherwise, you could probably get a handy person up there for relatively cheap to do that. The bigger cellar builds, when you get into cooling and all that stuff, is a whole different story.
Right. So then, looking at the cellar, I know some people will take these racks and hang them, for example, underneath a stairwell or something of that nature. But many of us want to build a full cellar. So a full cellar will involve temperature, humidity. Is that important? I mean, I sort of know this answer, but from your perspective, should you be storing wine in these conditions where it's temperature controlled and humidity controlled and so on?
So I'm going to answer the same way I've answered the other. It depends. Again, there's always a depends on these things. Number one, know that whether you're drinking, collecting 2-buck chuck or the best vintages of Burgundy, a cool, dark cellar is going to be the best for the wine, period. Like you can't really massage a nice bottle of $2 wine, right? So you can't really ever overdo it. But we know that wine likes, if you're aging wine, it likes to kind of, there's a lot of scientific stuff going on in that bottle, chemical reactions, and it likes really mellow everything. So constant temperature, etc. So for someone like you, and we've talked about your wine collection, the things that you have in there, and the fact that you've got bottles you want to maybe open in 15 years, unless you are living in the mountains and have a subterranean basement that already has those built-in kind of cave-like conditions, then you absolutely want to think about investing in those types of things. If you're more of a casual drinker and just want to, show off some bottles that you're going to drink in the next year, 2-3 years, you don't need to invest in that as long as you use common sense. And common sense is literally as easy as touching the wall that you're hanging the wine on. Does it get hot? If so, don't put wine there. If it stays cool, then it's going to be totally fine for your everyday drinking wines. So does that answer your question? Kind of a range?
It does, because I know a lot of people don't have the opportunity to put cooling units or humidification units inside the room, and it requires a little bit of more of an investment. I mean,
absolutely.
We spend a lot of money on wine. in your ballpark, what would you say if I was 4 walls covered with wine racks? What would you say the cost of that to build a decent mid-sized cellar?
Yeah, so here's where we can come again. Now I'm going to answer you depends, because that's the easiest answer for everything that you're going to ask me. It all depends. If you're that casual drinker, you might get away for $500, $600, $700 in wine racks, depending on size and scale. For that person investing in cooling, it's really hard to do a cooled wine cellar for less than $15,000 completely built, and that's a small built cellar. Right. We typically see the projects, the kind of, I don't know if there's anything such as an average project, but that mid-sized cellar without a tremendous amount of glass or extravagant kind of upgrades between $25,000 and $40,000. That is something that is common, happens all the time, and don't be shocked from it. There's a lot of factors that can drive that up. We see sellers, there's a wine cellar builder out of the tri-state area, New York, and they did one in Long Island. That was $125,000 for the full build out. It was a 2-story. It was bigger than my former colleague's apartment, right?
Right.
And so when you add in like cool glass and 2 levels of rack of 2 stories, a glass floor, light kits, you can spiral. I wouldn't call it out of control, because that homeowner loved every minute of that cellar, but you can obviously see you can go crazy on that. But plan on spending 25 to 40. Know that if you have custom requests, bigger scale, that can easily go a lot higher than that.
Right. And it's interesting because some people will collect wine as an investment, but we don't think of our wine cellars as an investment. People put pools in their backyard. Does it improve the value of their home? If I put a wine cellar in my home, does it actually increase the value of my property? Do people look for this? Will there be an ROI on this wine cellar?
A little bit. So this is where we come into, depends what level of the what level of the sale process you might be in. So we've seen some research that suggests you get about $5,000 back, up dollar for dollar, up to $5,000 back for a wine feature. So if you're spending $40,000, you're obviously going to get pennies back on the dollar. So it better be for enjoyment and love and all that stuff. That said, when we speak to realtors across, this is mostly in the U.S., I'm going to make a leap of faith and assume it's the same when we cross over into Toronto, into Canada, into your neck of the woods. They say the top 5% of a home value market in your city. So in Denver, that's close to, call it $2 million. A wine feature is a must-have in the resale market. So they're seeing things where if you're in that high end, it's going to sell quicker, and it could be the difference between it not selling. Right. At least in a period of time. So it's going to make your house more competitive to sell. And we've seen some research that say that homes with wine features, not necessarily only because of the wine feature, but they sell above ask and their desired amenities. So if you're flipping a house, absolutely you're going to get a ton of value out of it, just because you're going to make it more competitive. Right. If you're looking for dollar, that's just the tougher thing. So, but mostly, you love your wine cellar. I'm sure that one day if you sell your house, you're going to enjoy getting a couple extra bucks.
I'm going to have to take my wine cellar with me. That's how much I love it. I'm going to have to get a portable cellar somehow. A few years ago when I built this wine cellar, which again, I'm very proud of, the option of wine wall wasn't really there. I think that's come in. It probably was there. I wasn't in the know about it. And I think it's come more in vogue in the last, let's say, 5 years or so, to the point where I just built a wine wall, but it's on a main floor. It's sun exposed, not direct sun exposed, but it's not like my cellar, which is dark and cool.
Right.
So how much do you think this makes a difference? Putting these wine walls up, feature walls, so to speak, on your main floor, which is very popular, and a little bit of sun or UV light affecting that wine.
Yeah, so that's really, again, you have to go back to 2 things. Are you casually having the wine up there and you're going to drink it really quickly, or is it going to be there for a long time? And is it really direct light, or is it just indirect? Because a couple of things to consider. Number one, UV rays can degrade wine really, really quickly. So if you have direct sunlight coming into that wine feature, you definitely want to mitigate that through shading systems, UV protectant film on some glass, take that precaution. The direct light in that main floor living without adding cooling to it is also going to mean you might have a slightly warmer room. So does it matter if it's 68 degrees in that room and it's a Cabernet that you're going to drink next year? Not really. If it's that 1965 Chateau Lafite, absolutely, that's going to make a difference. So, perspective. Now, when I give a lot of webinars, right, and I do a lot of outreach and education stuff for the design community, and they're always asking those questions, and I'm always like, no light, no heat, no whatever, and then I have a slideshow of all these glass enclosed wine cellars, and they're like, you're crazy, right?
Right.
And the answer to that is, if you want to collect wine and you want a glass enclosed cellar, you can pull it off, but it's got to take a lot of planning, and you have to factor in all those things early on. So, main floor glass, do the UV protectant film. Make sure that you have doubled, if not tripled, the capacity of the wine cooling unit. Done everything you can to kind of mitigate these factors, and you can do it. But it becomes more expensive, and a lot more planning to pull that off.
Yeah, I did put a cooling unit in this wine wall that I just built, and I was quite happy about that, because the other key is vibration. Vibration from a cooling unit can affect the wine, and I was a little bit worried about the trade-off: vibration versus cooling versus sunlight. I mean, there's so many factors that play into this to optimize that wine. And I guess your point is well taken. If you're going to drink that wine within a short space, you're fine. If you're going to age wine, I don't know if that's the place necessarily to age wine.
At least not without thinking about all those factors, right? And understanding how to mitigate those. Because we've seen some beautiful glass enclosed wine rooms, main floor, that were done well at extra planning and expense, so that you can age wines there.
Yeah.
But you have to take those. You can't just put up a glass wall and expect it to work. And we get in a lot of arguments. There's a lot of wine cellar builders out there who will argue whether you can use single pane kind of shower glass or double, triple pane. And that's a really important distinction too. If you're looking for main floor and you want to do a glass enclosed room, which everybody does right now, single pane glass you can absolutely use for a cooled wine cellar environment. However, it's really tough to get to that ideal cellaring temperature of 55 degrees with that. So it might be better for your 10-year wines, not your 30-year wines, if that makes sense. If you're a serious collector and you want the flash of glass, invest in the double or triple pane framed glass systems, because that will absolutely make a difference of longevity and aging.
No, that's very good. I think that's why, in some ways, they put these reds in dark bottles, because they wanted to somehow interfere a little bit with UV light coming through, or darken the inside of that bottle. But you can't rest on that, of course. I think what you said are perfect. It's I love the fact that people are collecting wine. I love the fact that we've had a good response to our app, and the fact that people are collecting wine and want to find their bottles.
Yeah.
Initially, I never had a problem finding my bottles with the vintage view racks, because they were quite unique.
Yeah.
They label forward. But then when you get some depth in them, and you get 2 or 3 behind each other, you do need to see that bottle behind. And that's where I think finding the bottle quickly is a good measure. But I think the blend between these vintage view metal racks together with InVintory, I think there couldn't be a better marriage than that, to be honest with you.
Yeah, and one of the reasons I like your app so much is, so I have a wine closet, not cooled, that's up on my main floor. It's got my decent wines that I will drink. I also have a crawl space where I have just boxes and boxes of my good stuff, because it's 62 degrees down there. And I never thought about doing any sort of cataloging. So I'm in this in-between stage. I aspire to be the wine collector like you, with the big basement cellar and all that. But right now my home doesn't allow for that. So in my case, I would imagine a lot of people with 100 bottles wouldn't think they need an inventory style system.
Right.
But I find it's imperative, because I forget what I have in the crawl space.
Right. Well,
and I'm bouncing between these 2 rooms.
100%. I started out with wine fridges, and we've all had the experience. You put your bottles in a wine fridge. How big can a wine fridge be? But when you need to find that bottle, and you start pulling out every shelf, going, I know it's in there someplace. We've all had that experience. And so with one of the big things I wanted to do with the app was be able to find the bottle on which shelf. In animation, the shelf comes out. You can see it's the left bottle on the 10th spot, and you find that bottle in a second. These things are invaluable to be able to find your bottles quickly.
Absolutely. Can you hear me right now? Because my
screen... I thought you were being very attentive to me. You were staring at me. I thought that was good. Well, I might be on here alone at this point. Oh, I think he's coming back. He might be coming back. technology is always a fun part of this. Well, if I'm still being recorded, I'll tell you that if you don't get a chance to see the vintage view racks, if you haven't had a chance to use them, I would say that should be your first stop. Look at these racks before you start building up giant wooden cellars. The metal racks make all the difference in the world. Okay, so I want to thank Jacob. I'll sign off there because I don't think he's coming back, but I'll sign off and